Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Starting off here today, you'll notice that I've got these DACs around the wrong way, or I say wrong way, I've got the backs facing towards you. And that's because I wanted you to notice straight away how similar these DACs are. What we've got here, as you'll already know from the title of the video, is the SMSL DO200 Mk2 and the SMSL DO300. Looking at them in terms of their inputs, outputs, their physical design, everything about them at first looks identical. But the price is different, and I was interested to see if there was actually any difference in performance. I want to start by saying a huge thanks to Associated Audio for sending these two out for me to review and compare. And then before we jump into the Glamour video, I just want to mention that the DO200 Mk2 has a retail price of $469 US, but I did see it on sale for $399 when I was researching this, so maybe that's the realistic sale price. And then the DO300 retails for $549 US. So there's a gap of anywhere from $80 to $150 US between these, and that kind of surprised me given how similar they look on the outside. We'll talk shortly about what's actually different on the inside, what's different in the menu and the features, but I was very curious to see if there was a significant sonic difference or if it was just a feature difference. I think the best place to really start this review is with a look at the physical design of these units, and that's partly because they're both exactly the same, so we can cover it off quickly, but it's also the simpler part before we start delving into what's different between them. And so to start off with, let's take a look at either one of these. I don't even know which one I picked up here, but what we've got here is a pair of XLRs and a pair of RCAs. That's your line outputs. And one nice thing with both of these units is that you can switch between having the XLRs or the RCAs or both. So if you've got a pair of active monitors running from one and maybe a different headphone amp from another, you can choose when those active monitors are going to be working and when they're not going to be receiving a signal. So it's a really nice feature to have that. While we're talking line outputs, you've also got the option on both devices of having the outputs set as a fixed or a variable line out. So you can either control the volume from here, or you can know that it's sending a maximum voltage signal out through those outputs. You can't split that control between the XLRs and the RCAs, so you've got to choose which way you want to go, but it's nice to have that flexibility. Moving on from there, we've got exactly the same digital inputs on both of these, and this is where I started to be surprised at the price difference and them both having the same inputs. And that's because we start to see some of the more unique, or maybe not unique, but the more unusual inputs on these devices, things like AES and I2S, and it's great to see them on products at this price level. In addition to I2S and AES, we've got the usual suspects. We've got USB-B, we've got coaxial, optical, and Bluetooth, and these will do Bluetooth up to LDAC and aptX HD. And then the final thing on the back of both devices is an IEC power input and a power switch. There is a standby mode accessed from the front, but that's going to give you full switch-off capabilities. Swinging around the device, and this is going to be really fast because the only things on the front of both devices is the control wheel, that's your volume, it's also your selector wheel and your selector button, and then other than that we've got a small but good quality LCD display, or maybe OLED, I didn't look into that. And so as you can see, both of these devices are absolutely identical physically on the outside. Where things get different is on the inside of the devices. So let's take a look at that now. I'm going to put some information on the screen and just talk through the key differences. And the first, and maybe the most obvious, and maybe even the most significant difference between them is they're using different DAC chips. So the DO200 Mk2 is using a pair of DAC chips, specifically the ES9068, and the DO300 is using the ES9039 Pro chip. Now at first you might think that by using a pair of DAC chips in the DO200 Mk2 that could be better than using a single DAC chip in the DO300, but these DAC chips are on quite different levels, and the 9039 Pro is a multi-channel DAC chip all on its own. Now whether that equates to better sound, we'll wait and see, but the key point I'm making here is don't judge these products by their DAC chips necessarily, because other things can influence the sound. And one of those things, if we jump around the table on the screen a little bit, is if we jump down and have a look at the op-amp situation. The DO200 Mk2 has a set of 5 op-amps, specifically the OPA 1612 op-amps, whereas in the case of the DO300, it's using 11 different op-amps, but they're not specified which ones. What that tells me is that these products are likely to sound just a little bit different, and that's because every op-amp has its own very slight coloration to the sound, some more than others, but all of them do have slightly different characters. The other thing that's a bit curious is the fact that by using 11 op-amps in the DO300, it made me wonder what they're using them all for. And I think possibly if we now look at the distortion levels, there is a difference in distortion levels between the DO200 Mk2 and the DO300, and they're significantly lower, although it's probably irrelevant once you get past a certain point. But in terms of numbers, the significantly lower number for THD in the DO300 makes me wonder if they're using some kind of feedback system, like a nested feedback circuit, and that's how they're reducing the distortion for the DO300, and that's possibly why they're using so many op-amps. Essentially, feedback systems mean that you're feeding the signal back through a series of op-amps, cancelling out noise and reducing total harmonic distortion as a result. So that's just a theory. I don't know if that's actually what's going on here. It's not being publicised or marketed that way. But the fact that there are so many op-amps in the DO300 compared to the DO200 Mk2 just made me wonder. The final two things worth pointing out, for those of you that use Tidal, for instance, and you actually care about MQA, I know many people don't care about MQA, but for those that do, I couldn't really get a sense of what exactly was the difference between the DO200 Mk2 and the DO300. On the marketing pages, it's listed that the DO200 Mk2 does full MQA decoding, whereas the DO300 is listed as hardware decoding. Now, MQA are still a little bit ambiguous with the way they explain what the differences are. There's not a set terminology used. And because MQA uses multiple layers of rendering and folding, I'm not really sure if hardware decoding is full decoding, if those are interchangeable terms, or if it's a little bit different. So if you are a big fan of MQA, you might need to dig into that one a little bit more yourself. I didn't dig into it because MQA is not something I tend to care about too much. Both of these will handle MQA, and I do have a feeling they might be on the same level of MQA decoding, but check that one out further if you want to know more detail. And finally, the one last thing I want to mention on this table of differences is that the clock circuit in the DO300 is specifically listed as an in-house SMSL produced clock. The reason the clock is important is that the more accurate the clock is, the better it's controlled, the more accurately the DAC can recreate the signal. So what's essentially happening is that the clock is used to find the exact timing of each sample in the reproduced audio stream, and so the more accurate that is, the better the reconstruction of the original signal will be. So there's a chance here, it's unspecified what's in the DO200 Mk2, but there's a chance here that the DO300 has a better clock system, and therefore it could be producing a better sound as a result, but we'll get to that in the sound section. Before we get to there though, let's move on from the internal kind of specification side of things and talk about some of the features that also separate these two. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. First of all, let's talk about what they have in common in terms of the menu features, and that is that both units will give you things like some filters, they'll give you things like the ability, as I said before, to switch which outputs are working, whether it's a fixed output or a variable output, and they also offer you SMSL sound color feature. The sound color feature is essentially a way of just adding a dash of character, a dash of color to the sound from these. It's not a fully fledged EQ, it's not going to let you tweak individual bands or frequencies, but what it does is it gives you 3 levels of adjustment across 3 different bands of sound. And as I understand it, I think it's producing it by adding a little bit of very deliberate distortion in different bandwidths or different harmonics, I should say. So for instance, it might be adding a second order harmonic or a third order harmonic distortion. And you can choose how much of that is added, and you can choose which of them is added. And so essentially what you're getting is the ability to add a bit of extra warmth in the bass, a bit of extra richness in the mid-range, or a bit of extra sparkle in the treble. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the names of them. I know the rich one is for bass, I know the crystal one is for treble, and I can't think of the name of the middle one. But the point is, you can tweak the sound a little bit. It's not a fully fledged EQ. It's not a feature that I personally use. I leave it switched off, and I've left it switched off for all the testing today. But it's there if you want to have a play around with it. And out of interest, if you are somebody that owns SMSL products that have this feature, let me know in the comments, do you use the sound color? Which one do you like? What's your preference, etc.? I'd be really keen to know. Moving on from sound color though, let's talk about a couple of things that do separate these in terms of that sort of menu features and functions type piece. And that is that the DO300 offers you a couple of things that the DO200 Mk2 doesn't. The first is you get more filters from the DO300. You also get the ability to have DSD filters, which the DO200 Mk2 doesn't. And then if you look closely at the filter list, the DO300 also offers you essentially a NOS mode, which means that it's not going to apply its own filters to the incoming digital stream. Now that could be really handy if you're somebody that likes to use HQ Player or Room to do your upsampling, and then all you want to do is have the DAC turn that signal into an analog signal and not do filtering and changing along the way. So that could be a really handy feature for some. It might be completely irrelevant for other people, but I thought I'd mention it. And so with all that said, what you can see now is that both DACs are very similar, but there are some key internal differences. And so that just leaves us with the question of, do they sound the same? Is there a difference? Which one should you spend your money on? Putting the two side by side, what I did was I had them both running with coaxial inputs from my digital to digital converter. I then ran XLRs out of both of these and into the Burson Soloist GT. So I was able to really quickly have exactly the same stream playing, have exactly the same volume levels on both DAC, which was that it was maxed out, and then switch back and forth with the Burson Soloist GT. What I heard as I did that was that both DACs sound very, very similar, but there is a slight difference. The DO300 to me has just slightly tighter, cleaner bass definition. It's not bassier or anything like that, but it's a little bit tighter, a little bit more controlled, and some may therefore feel like it's a bit punchier, depending on how you define punch. The other thing I noticed in the favour of the DO300 was that I think the image focus and the separation of sounds is just a tiny bit better from it. It's a pretty close call, it's not a huge difference, but it's enough that I'd say that if you are after the absolute best possible sounding one of these two, I do think the DO300 is potentially worth the extra money. But that said, if you'd rather put that extra $80 to $150 towards a different headphone amp or a pair of headphones, you're probably going to get bigger gains from that, if that makes sense. And I'll come back around and summarise all of this at the end as to which ones I would buy in which case. But before we get there, I also want to put these into context, because in comparing them against one another, the differences were small. It certainly seems like there's a good reason to spend more on the DO300 compared to the DO200 Mk2, but that all depends on whether or not either of these are even worth considering in the broader market. And so I looked around for some other products at similar levels and did some comparisons. The first comparison I tried was to put the DO200 Mk2 up against the recently reviewed Eversolo DAC Z6. The DAC Z6 comes in at just $30 more than the recommended retail price of the DO200 Mk2, and at that price what you're getting for your money is also a headphone output, a beautiful design device with a lovely screen and a display and interface, but at the same time it doesn't have things like the I2S or the AES connectors. And so I was interested to see if the DAC Z6 could overcome not having those extra inputs by having better overall sound quality and of course a headphone stage. Something else that I might mention that separates these two, but is not a reason to buy one over the other, is that they're using exactly the same DAC chip combination, meaning that they've both got a pair of the same 9068 chips, but they're using different op amps, so that should lead to a slightly different colour in the sound. Once I set them up so I could switch back and forth with the Soloist once again, what I heard from these two was a sound that was basically indistinguishable. They are very, very similar sounding DACs. To my ears, the DO200 has just a slightly richer mid-range. It's very, very subtle, but it's a slightly fuller sound through the mids. And then on the flip side, the DAC Z6 feels like it's got just a little bit more treble extension and treble sparkle, but that also could just be that it's not being offset by those richer mids of the DO200. And so ultimately what I'd say is that they're close enough that it really makes no difference. I'm not sitting here for a second suggesting that in a blind listening test I could tell you which one was which. It's enough that I could say they're different, but it's not enough that I could pick which one was the DAC Z6 and which one was the DO200 Mk2. And so the point of saying that is that if you're in the market and you're looking at around about that sort of $400 to $500 range, I think either of these are great choices. Of course, if the DO200 Mk2 is selling for $399, that's a full $100 difference, and I really don't see, unless you need the headphone stage, I really don't see any reason to choose the DAC Z6 over the DO200 Mk2. But at the retail price, the recommended retail price of the DO200 Mk2, where there's just a $30 difference, then I think the aesthetic design of the DAC Z6 combined with having a headphone stage, that for me makes it the more appealing unit. Because ultimately I don't think you could or maybe should choose based on the sonic performance, they're both identical. So choose based on features, whether you want things like I2S and AES, or whether you want a headphone stage and what I think is a nicer looking design. And so let's park that one there and move on to my other comparison, which was to see how the DO300 stacked up against another SMSL product in the M500 Mark III. So the M500 Mark III is another product that has a headphone stage, much like the DAC Z6. But the M500 is priced much closer to the DO300 than the DO200. Specifically, the M500 comes in, and this is the Mark III version, that comes in at $530 US, so it's only $19 different from the DO300. Once again, we've got a situation where you're trading off functions and features. In the M500, you don't have the extra digital inputs, so no I2S, no AES, but you are getting a headphone output. One other key difference, and it's a very, very subtle difference, is that the M500 Mark III is using the ES9038 Pro chip, and the DO300 has the newer 9039 Pro chip. So we've got exactly the same chip, but the newer generation in the DO300. Whether that makes a difference, that's a whole other question. Once I set these two up, jumping back and forth with the Soloist GT again, what I heard was that the sound between these two is basically indistinguishable. It's a really hard call as to which one is which. I think possibly the DO300 sounds just a hair cleaner. It's got a little bit smoother sound that's also cleaner and more maybe transparent, you could say, but it's so tight, I would challenge anyone to pick it. And I include myself in that because having them side by side, the differences are so close that I might be making it up. I had no vested interest in one of them sounding a different way or being better or worse than another, but I also don't entirely trust that I was hearing a real difference. If I was hearing a difference, then the M500 also comes across as maybe just being a little bit more forward, a little bit closer to you. So not forward in the sense of shouty, but just having a little bit less space overall, a little bit less distance from the listener to the sound, but it's again a very subtle difference. And so much like I said for the DO200 and the DAC Z6, I think the same could be said for the DO300 and the M500 Mark III. And that is that I think you should choose based on features, not based on sonic performance. I think all four products that I've talked about here are about equal to each other in the sense that the DAC Z6 and the DO200 are clearly about the same, and then there's just a small incremental step up to the DO300 and the M500. And so with that in mind, I think your decision to purchase one or the other should really come down more so to features and functions than it should to sonic performance. And so to bring all this to a close, I just want to clarify my thoughts here and hopefully give you some clarity when you're making your own decisions. Putting aside the DAC Z6 and the M500 for a moment, if you're looking just for a pure DAC and these two are on your radar, I think they're both excellent. If you're looking at these two options and you're one of those people where you know you're only going to be happy and relaxed if you know in your heart that you've got the best possible sonic performance out of your choice, then I do think the DO300 is worth choosing. But having said that, if you're not one of those people and it's really just about having excellent quality sound, I think unless you're comparing these two side by side, you're unlikely to ever know there was a difference. And so what that brings us to is the differences in features. And just to remind you the key differences there, the reasons you might choose the DO300 over the DO200 Mark II is really going to come down to the fact of whether you care about DSD filtering. Obviously both of them do filtering, but you have control over it in the DO300, and or if you want to use some sort of external upsampling and you want what's equivalent to a NOS mode in the DO300. So there's that feature in the filter list for PCM, and that's going to allow you to switch off additional filtering being done by the DO300 and just use whatever stream's coming in from say HQ Player or Roon. And so ultimately where that leaves us is that we've got two excellent quality DACs here, but what it also tells us is that we've reached a point in this hobby, and we've been here for a little while now, where anything around this same sort of price point is going to do a great job. So don't obsess over the numbers, the measurements, which one's going to sound like what. If you're not having them side by side as I did and flipping back and forth, you're really never going to hear a difference. And that could even be said going from something like the DAC Z6 all the way to the DO300. I still think there's only such a minimal difference that it's not going to jump out at you. Yes, the DO300 is the best sounding option of all the four I talked about today, but it's by a very, very small margin. So consider how much that's important to you compared to saving some money, putting that money into other products, and hopefully you can make a great buying decision for yourself. And so as always, I hope you found the video useful and helpful. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.